Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning to those of you joining us from different parts of the world, and a very warm welcome to this platform on behalf of ILGA World. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the CESCR Committee and Trans Rights Advocacy at CESCR. So to start off this webinar, I would like to invite somebody very special to say a few words to welcome all of you. So may I now invite Mr. Jabu Pereira, chairperson of the Trans Steering Committee of ILGA World, and also a very senior rights activist from South Africa, to say a few words to welcome all of you. Jabu, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Chimindra, and I just want to really, it's 2021 and it's so really good to just click on the panelists and the attendees and to see all the familiar people, voices, and activists. And I just really want to take a moment, firstly, to wish you all really, really well. We have pulled through 2020. And I feel immensely confident that as a trans community, we're going to pull through 2021. I think this moment of uncertainty and this moment of so much change, and particularly various distresses that we experience in our personal and our professional lives as trans people. I feel spaces like this are just so immensely important to us. It's a space of solidarity, and to me, even though I'm looking at you through a screen, it is a space that I know that we can all reach out to each other far more deeper when we need to. So I just want to really salute you all for being here and for being present. I know we all are under so many immense pressures and so on, and we're here and we're showing up. And also just to say thank you to the team at ILGA and all the ILGA partners that have made this practical guide possible, and even former staff of ILGA that like Zan, this journey in terms of how we as trans activists engage at the UN level, these battles that have been led by GATE and TGU, ILGA and so forth. I think there's so many lessons in this for us, and I think we're pushing forward despite perhaps smaller gains, but we've also had much bigger gains at the UN level. So I really hope that in a way, when we're looking at this guide, we are finding more opportunities and how we forge forward on the victories that we want. So thanks again, and I'm going to hand over to Ksenia. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jabu. So to introduce the key document of this webinar would be the Guide on Gender Identity and Expression prepared by ILGA World. So for that, I would invite my colleague, UN coordinator at ILGA World, Ksenia Kirchenko.
Thank you, Chamindra, and thank you, Jabu, and warm welcome to everyone who joined today. So I want to present to you this guide, and I have some slides prepared for this. I hope that you can see it now. So I was one of the persons who well, first of all, I am coordinating and leading ILGA's work on treaty bodies, and therefore I worked quite a lot on different treaty bodies, including CESCR committee and specifically with trans activists. But also I decided to take this task of updating the guide and to present it in a way that you can find now on our website. So just to start, I hope you can see this presentation. Unfortunately, it's only in English, but we can share it with you, and maybe later we can also translate it into Spanish if needed. So CESCR, first of all, the basis of all this advocacy is a specific document, specific international treaty about human rights, so-called Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It's a very important document because it establishes the universal rights in the field of social, economical, cultural life. It was adopted decades ago in 1966. And at that time, no one really on the international space, no one really discussed gender identity, trans identities, and therefore the convention itself does not mention specifically gender identity or gender expression or trans populations. Nevertheless, during these decades, the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and I have one additional slide specifically on the committee. So anyway, the committee developed the practice of interpretation of this convention to include LGBTI and specifically trans people in different articles related to this convention. And generally the convention, you can see on this picture, so the dark blue color, it presents countries that ratified the convention. So if your country is in dark blue, it means that you can engage with this committee to organize your trans advocacy. And this convention includes different types of different rights, starting from gender-based violence, domestic violence, but also hate crimes against trans people, and also different types of rights in the field of health, education, employment, housing, economic justice, water and sanitation, scientific progress, culture in general, and different cultural identities, for example, but also access to cultural events. So as I said, there is a CESCR committee. It's basically a specific United Nations expert body that was established to monitor the implementation of this convention, of this treaty, and rights enshrined in this treaty by state parties, which means that if your country ratified this convention, it has to specifically periodically report about what is happening to social, economic, and cultural rights of people of this country. It has to report it to the committee. So this committee, it consists of 18 independent experts. So you can see some of them in this picture, and some of them, I would say, really trans friendly, and they are ready to ask different governments, government delegations about what is happening, for example, to legal gender recognition or access to gender neutral bathrooms, or, for example, criminalization of cross-dressing, so-called, in different countries. This committee implements 3 main methods of work, and all of them, specifically 2 of them, are really relevant for grassroots defenders. One of them is periodic country review, and the other one is individual communications. So periodic country review, it's maybe the easiest way for you to engage with the committee. And individual communications, it's a mechanism when you can actually bring cases to this committee. So for example, in Latin America, we have Inter-American Court of Human Rights. In Europe, we have European Court of Human Rights. And this mechanism is very similar. So basically you can, for example, submit a case on legal gender recognition firstly to your national courts, and then after exhausting all the domestic remedies up to, for example, Supreme Court or Constitutional Court, if you didn't get a positive decision, you can go to this committee. But in this presentation and today, we will be focusing more on periodic country reviews. And here is a simple scheme of what stages are included in country reviews. So one cycle consists of 6 main stages, and it starts from state report. So states that ratify the convention, they have to submit to the committee periodic reports about situation of people in this country every 4 or 5 years. So the first step is state is submitting the report to the committee. Then the committee holds a procession. So they, committee experts, they sit together, they read the report, they also read other information. And then based on this preliminary assessment, they also create so-called list of wishes, which means questions to the government or requests to provide more information about specific populations or specific problems. And it's basically a document with the list of questions and issues to get more information about what is happening there. So, for example, they can say, they can ask the committee, what is the concrete legislation on legal gender recognition procedure in the country, or whether or not gender reassignment procedures are covered by basic health insurance. Then the next step is a main session, and it's a very important stage. So basically here, it's here in Geneva, and the committee here meets state delegation, and there is also constructive dialogue. So first of all, the delegation presents the report, saying what were the achievements, what are still challenges, and then committee members can ask different questions directly, ask it to the government. And then the result of all this is so-called concluding observations, which is another important document, which includes different achievements from this state with regard to social, economic, cultural rights. So, for example, the committee can commend a state for adopting positive, progressive legal gender recognition procedure. And then there is also a very important part with concerns and consequently recommendations to the state for the next stage, for the next review cycle. And then the next stage is follow-up. And these pink pictures are NGOs opportunities. So as civil society, you can actively participate in this cycle, and you can submit written information or so-called shadow reports. You can do it for the procession. And in this report, you can, for example, recommend specific wording for questions to the government. And you can also submit a shadow report for the main session. With more concrete information about what are the problems faced by trans populations in your country, and also provide some suggestions for recommendations. Also, you can actually participate in this session because there are NGO briefings. So meetings of the committee members with representatives of civil society. It's a private meeting, so government is not participating then, but you as civil society can also come to Geneva, or sometimes it's organized online, and you can actually engage with the committee members, make statements, explain to them what are really the problems of trans people in your country, and you can do it both during the procession and also the main session. And of course, civil society's very important role is monitoring to see how the state actually implement or does not implement recommendations made by the committee. And now more about trans-specific recommendations. So on this diagram, you can see information about CESCR recommendations made from 2014 until 2019. And the blue part is about all the recommendations that mentioned any issues related to LGBTI. And the pink one is trans-inclusive references. Trans-inclusive means that usually it's recommendation on all LGBT, for example, communities. And, sorry? Everything is okay? Okay, and the green one is trans-specific references, trans-specific recommendations, for example, on legal gender recognition. Most of them were about legal gender recognition, or sometimes it's also about health. So you can see that generally the number of these recommendations are growing throughout the years, and a very important factor contributing to this development is actually participation of civil society. But in terms of trans-specific recommendation, there is still a lot of space for growth. So yeah, and in order to provide you useful tips and information about how to work with this committee in 2016, my colleagues at that time, Helen Nolan, who was working on treaty bodies and special procedures, and Zhang Qiam, I'm sure many of you know him. So they created the first guide. It was more or less simple guide. At that time, it was just published in a Word document and it was translated into Russian. So we had it in English and in Russian. And it was the first guide that we prepared specifically for trans community on how to use CESCR mechanisms in their advocacy. And last year, we decided to update this guide and we publish it in a more beautiful form with a professional design. And also specifically, Jabu provided very important suggestions on how to make this guide even better for you as local defenders. And we have this updated version of the guide also on our website, and it's in English and in Spanish. So what you can find here in this guide, you can find there are a lot of information about what is CESCR, what are CESCR's working methods, on what stages and how civil society can provide their information and input. And then also there are interesting chapters about what issues relevant for trans communities actually CESCR already covered. So for example, legal gender recognition procedures, to some extent access to transition related healthcare, to some extent criminalization of gender expression and some forms of gender expression, and also gaps and opportunities. So what else? What are the other problems relevant for trans populations that has not yet been covered by CESCR, but could be in the future addressed by this committee if civil society, including your organizations, will provide this information to the committee. Also, there are different types of practical tips and challenges, some examples of national advocacy, and also additional information about other resources and organizations and groups that can provide you support in the form of, for example, financial support or drafting your reports or providing training to grassroots activists. And this is just I just want to give you one example of positive changes brought to local trans communities because of the trans advocacy organized with this CESCR committee. So this case is from my home country, Russia. And for a long time, for well, basically almost 3 decades, the situation was as follows. So we had legislation on acts of civil status. This law was adopted in 1997, but the law was also saying that the Ministry of Health had to adopt regulation, under law regulation, detailing legal gender recognition procedure. And this under regulation, this decree has not been adopted for almost 3 decades. And therefore, because of that, it was sometimes possible for trans people to change their documents. But because there was no procedure, the procedure was basically different in different regions. And in some regions, we had more or less progressive procedures. For example, there was no requirement for surgeries or even hormonal treatment, while in other regions of Russia, there were really strict and abusive requirements. Sometimes, even, for example, mastectomy was not considered as enough reason to change a trans man's documents, for instance. And then in 2017, there was a country periodic review of Russia by CESCR, and Transgender Legal Defense Project, specific organization from Russia. They wrote and submitted to the committee a standalone report on the situation of trans people, and specifically these problems related to legal gender recognition procedure, but also different consequences. So for example, because trans people cannot change their documents, they experience problems in education or employment, etc., etc. And also Transgender Legal Defense Project participated in a coalition shadow report, which means I think it's a very good tip if you can provide information about specific situation of trans people in your country. but also participate in a broader coalition report, I think it's the best strategy. So then during the session, activists, so this is Diana in a white shirt. She's a trans woman, trans activist from Russia who actually came to Geneva and presented this report and also meet with committee members and organize different activities, as a result of which Russia received the first recommendation from UN body to put in place quick, transparent and accessible procedure for change of trans persons documentation. And right after that, like literally maybe 1 month or 2 months after that, the Russian Ministry of Health finally, after 3 decades of doing nothing, they published initially a draft regulation for legal gender recognition procedure, and then they actually adopted it. And of course, it's not like it's not the best procedure in the world. So it's unfortunately it's not based on self-determination. So it's still medicalization and pathologization because diagnosis is still needed. But at least this procedure does not include any like even hormonal treatment or surgeries, which is like from the regional perspective, the perspective of like Eastern Europe and Central Asia, it's quite a good decision, also taking into account that right now Russia is not the most LGBTI-friendly state. So that was one of the positive results, and why we think that actually it was a result of advocacy, of CESCR advocacy, is because for 3 decades, the Ministry of Health didn't do anything, and only a month after this recommendation, they actually developed this procedure. And the last slide is about upcoming reviews. So this is a list of countries which will be very soon reviewed by CESCR. And if you see your country in this list, then you can think about actually organizing some advocacy activities, collecting information about situation of trans people in your country or your region, and also asking the committee to ask specific questions related to this problem, or made specific recommendations to your government to make sure that the situation is improving. And if you want to organize this advocacy, you can contact us specifically, but I think any of presenters during this webinar. And for ILGA World, you can contact either Chimindra or me. So this is my email address, and we would be happy to provide any possible support for your advocacy and engagement with this committee.
Thank you very much, Xenia, for a very comprehensive and very insightful presentation on the CESCR committee and specific aspects of and past precedents of trans rights advocacy, GIE, gender identity and expression related advocacy at CESCR. Now, at this stage, I would like to invite few colleagues from trans-led international bodies who are joining us today to present their perspectives on engagement with CESCR as trans-led, trans-competent organizations. And our first speaker in the lineup is Mr. Jonas Ham from Transgender Europe. Jonas, who is the policy officer of Transgender Europe based in Berlin. Jonas, the floor is yours. Very warm, very welcome.
So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. And especially for the translators, please do remind me if I get too fast. Sometimes I tend to do that. Disclaimer, TGU so far has not actively engaged with the CESCR so far, but we think it's a great tool and we have some ideas of how it might be used to advance trans rights. And we're thrilled to be here and to hear other people's ideas and experiences and engage. Another disclaimer, apologies in advance. Many of these ideas are still coming very much from a Western European perspective, and we're working to expand that. But then let's get started. So CESCR as an international tool is great because it covers so many countries worldwide and its scope is so broad, and we can use it to advocate for trans rights where other treaties might not apply. We have some concrete ideas how to apply the covenant on specific human rights violations that trans people face in many countries. For example, when submitting shadow reports. So first of all, the right to non-discriminate. The right to non-discrimination basically can be used to advocate against any legislation that discriminates against trans people on the ground of gender identity, and we think it can be used as an argument for quick, transparent, and accessible legal gender recognition, also inclusive of non-binary identities. My personal favorite is the right to health. It explicitly links to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health. It specifically includes mental health, and also includes the right to sexual and reproductive health and the right to health without discrimination, including on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. And it has been linked to other human rights, such as liberty and security of the person and prohibition of torture and the right to privacy. So it's a huge, this article in itself is huge. So we think that it can be used to advocate for the right to trans-specific healthcare from a holistic viewpoint without psychopathologization or discriminations. It can be used to argue against degrading treatment by healthcare professionals. It can be used against invasive requirements for trans people, such as a real-life test or as some healthcare professionals want, detailed explanation of one's sex lives in order to receive a trans diagnosis. It can be used to argue against the right order of transition, such as required in many healthcare protocols. Example would be hormones first and then surgery after. Would not be part of a holistic point. It can be used to argue against sterilization requirements in LGR, legal gender recognition procedures. It can be used to argue against discrimination towards trans people with regards to artificial insemination, for example, and or also to argue against lack of access to so-called gender-specific healthcare for trans people after transitioning, like, for example, pap smears for trans men or prostate cancer screenings for trans women. These are unavailable in many countries because, because it's just not foreseen in the healthcare system, and it can also be used to argue for against lack of access for treatment for non-binary trans people. But these are just a few ideas. There would be many more applications possible. The right to work can be used to argue for the need of effective measures against discrimination in the workplace, but also the establishment of best practice procedures. The right to protection of the family and mothers and children, Article 10. Okay, so now that you're actually also seeing what I'm seeing, let's go on with the right to protection of family, mothers, and children. We think that this can be used as an argument for protections of trans youth from abusive parents, but also for the protection of trans parents who might be going through divorce after transitioning or while transitioning and are often afraid or in danger of losing custody of their children. And then, of course, it can be used to argue for the recognition of trans parents according to their gender identity, since many countries in Europe and Central Asia do not permit trans parents to be listed with their proper name and gender in their children's birth certificate, even after they have legal gender recognition. And then finally, the right to education. We believe that that can be used to argue for non-discrimination measures and positive actions for trans people in schools and other educational settings. Because of course, discrimination and negation of one's gender identity stops trans people from having a good learning environment where they can actually receive an education and fulfill their potential. So we believe it can be argued for schools' obligation to respect trans children's name and identity and pronouns, and also make a positive obligation for them to protect and defend the rights of their trans students against, for example, bullying from other students or teachers. And then last but not least, we believe that can also be an argument for LGBTI inclusive educational curricula that involve learning about gender identity and gender diversity in schools in a non-discriminatory manner. And with that, I'd like to close and say thank you very much and give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Jonas. Thanks very much. And now I may invite our colleague from APTN, Ms. Samreen Shabazz, who is the Advocacy Manager at the Asia Pacific Transgender Network based in Bangkok, Thailand. And Samreen is joining us during a staff retreat of APTN from the north of Thailand. Thank you very much, Samreen, for taking the time to join us. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction as well. So I will be speaking about, so firstly, my apologies, there are technology-related issues and internet connectivity-related issues. I'm not return my video. I will be talking about our engagement with ICESCR and how we have been working with our country partners and with young trans human rights defenders in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Pacific to localize ICESCR to amplify their advocacy. So we launched a capacity building program last year. It's titled Amplifying Trans Advocacy Fellowship, and we invited young trans human rights defenders to attend that fellowship. As part of that fellowship, we conducted a month-long online course on how to use Universal Periodic Review to advance local advocacy and how to use different treaties and treaty monitoring body mechanism to promote and strengthen local advocacy. So one of the fellows, and I wanted to share this example because I think it's an excellent example to share in terms of how advocates can use ICESCR and different tools that ICESCR provides to support their advocacy. I'm specifically talking about Article 12 and CESCR Committee's General Comment number 14, which is on the right to health. Before talking about this case study, just a little bit more information on general comments. And of course, the toolkit also has more details about it. So in general comments, the committee, they provide detailed remarks on an interpretation on each of the covenant's provisions. And they also provide guidelines on how to operationalize different provisions of the covenant. So the article itself, the Article 12 itself in ICESCR is very brief. It's right to health. But what does that mean? What does that entail? All those details, all that interpretation can be found in general comment and in general comment number 14. And in that general comment, there is an excellent framework on access to health and what does that mean? So there is a framework availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality framework. We call it triple Q. And that framework, it provides a guideline and an outline on how to include and how to use an intersectional approach in policymaking, in programming to ensure universal access to healthcare. So we had a detailed session in our online course on AAAQ framework and on some of the other guidelines that different treaty monitoring bodies have provided through their general comments. And one of our fellows from Sri Lanka, they proposed an excellent advocacy project as after the fellowship. They wanted to use they proposed to use AAAQ framework to do a situational analysis of access to gender affirming care in northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka. Now, those who are not familiar with that geographical area, there is a ethnic and religious minority, Tamil and Muslims, and it's a rather remote or underprivileged geographical area. So um, they wanted to use AAAQ framework to study how gender identity, how religious identity, how ethnic minority, how their geographical location, and all of these things intersect with each other, and how it affects their access to gender affirming healthcare. So they wanted to, they're using AAAQ framework to do a situational analysis of um, access to these services in northern and eastern Sri Lanka. So after that, they are also proposing using this framework to propose policy recommendations and healthcare programming recommendations. And this is, just an example or to share that while advocates ISESCR and CESCR treaty monitoring bodies are excellent tools to hold your governments accountable, but it also provides you a tool to develop and define policy policy and programming recommendations, and it provides a framework where where you know where little information on intersectional approaches are available. So CESCR and the general comment number 14 of CESCR is a very interesting tool for advocates to use and to expand their understanding of what access to healthcare could entail and could mean, and then using that framework, develop policy and programming recommendations and lobby with their stakeholders accordingly. So we at Asia Pacific Transgender Network, we haven't directly engaged with the CESCR committee, but we have been building capacity of advocates to use these tools and to localize these tools to amplify their advocacy. Yeah, that's all from my end. I just wanted to share this case study to to talk a little bit about the different usabilities of general comments and ISESCR's provisions.
Thank you very much, Samreen. And thanks once again for joining us during a busy time. And now I would like to invite our colleague from the East Africa Trans Health Advocacy Network, ETAN. And representing ETAN, we have Ms. Barbara Moroga, who is the Executive Director of ETAN. And Barbara is also a member of the Trans Steering Committee at ILGA World. Barbara, a very warm welcome to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I apologize at some point. I was having technical difficulties, but I am here now. So, first of all, I just want to say that our experience in spaces, especially UN mechanisms, human rights mechanisms, are pretty low. We actually are the least like we've literally not participated as much at the UN level as compared to other, other regions of the world, especially, the Europe, global North tend to have that opportunity, tend to have that funding, tend to have that. And so from the beginning, we as activists, as African activists, we've not been able to have that opportunity to actually engage at a meaningful way, and at a level that makes sense and that can actually make changes, right? However, we're doing a lot of work on our own. We're doing a lot of work to get ourselves to that point. And I think one of the biggest opportunities, or rather the biggest milestones that we've had as a community is that we have been able to start the African Trans Network. I don't know whether any one of you have heard of it. But yeah, we started the African Trans Network. We had our first, official meeting last year in 2020, and we've been doing a lot of work over the last few months, over the last year, and moving forward. And we have actually been focusing a lot on ensuring that we as a community, as a trans community, trans, intersex, non-binary community across the continent of Africa is as involved as possible towards the realization of a better world for ourselves in Africa. And having several conversations with the community to make sure that we actually are doing the right thing, to make sure that we are actually participating, we are involved, we are aware of what's happening, and we are not doing things, the way other places can be, where it's only a few people from a few countries that are starting something that is affecting the entire continent. And so we've done extensive consultations to ensure that as many trans activists, as many non-binary activists and organizations are involved in the process of the formation of the ATN. And so we did a lot of that last year, and we're still continuing to do so this year. And so we really, really are excited about it. And again, going back to my earlier point, really, I think the challenge that we've had over the years with engaging the UN system, including the community, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, is that we've been left out basically by the rest of the community, the rest of the people who are doing the work at that UN level. We have tried to push for our engagement, but I remember the last time we had this conversation, it was mostly around, oh, you don't have money, you don't have support, so we can't help you, we can't have you there. And we're like, it's not right, it's not fair. And I think that this is something that we really needed to emphasize, that it's important for us, if we are a global community, if we have the same issues, overall we have the same issues, it's important that you involve everybody, that you don't leave the continent of Africa behind. When you're having engagements as Europe, as North America, as Asia, whatever it is, if you're having such an engagement, something like the Trans Advocacy Week, I think such of these things really, I think it would be really useful to ensure that you involve the people of the continent of Africa, the activists who've been doing a lot of work to ensure that we have the realization of our rights in this country, in this continent, right? And so I think that's what we would want to stress in a space like this, that you don't leave the community behind. The community in Africa, but we are doing our best. So as I was saying, like in terms of how exactly we can engage this committee, I think, as I said, it is important that we have a collective action, that we don't leave each other. I think it's also important for us to work together towards providing some support, funding support, capacity support, technical support to African activists. Now that we have the ATN, we can do that. But also remember, the ATN is regional networks such as Ethan, such as Southern Africa Transforum, West Africa Transforum, and the North African Trans Network or Transat, So it is important that we provide that type of support to these organizations, to this active. Having a activist activity, if you're having, like the Trans Advocacy Week, I think it would be really good to say, okay, we're going to do affirmative action. We're going to talk to the donors that are supporting us to go to the spaces to also support activists from the continent able to bring out their issues at these spaces. It is important. I think it is important. It is something as an activist that you should think about and say, if you're going to call ourselves an international NGO, if you're going to call ourselves an organization that's doing work across the world, the entire world. Don't leave out some of these spaces. Don't say that Africans don't know shit. I'm sorry, Africans don't know anything. Don't say that we don't have the capacity. So even if we attend, we're not doing anything. It is important to involve us. It is important to work. Then we're doing the right thing and we're doing work together, right? And I hope I've been able to cover as much as I could. I haven't necessarily gone off track, but I think when I was having these conversations with my colleagues in Africa, my colleagues in the interim governing body of the network, this is one of the major issues that came across. And it was important for us to have this conversation as raw and as open as it is to ensure that the representation of the people of the African continent is not left behind. We are not left behind. We might not have the funding, but we have the experience, we have the capacity. Please don't leave out the African continent. Don't leave out the African activists. Don't say that we don't have capacity. Don't say that we don't have funding. You have the capacity, you have the pool, you have the reach, and you have the privilege of actually being able to fundraise and access money to be able to do advocacy at the international level, at the UN level. If we don't have that opportunity, then we're left out. And I think it is our collective responsibility to ensure that when we are advocating at the global level, when we are talking about global trans rights, that you're not living out the continent of Africa. That's what I wanted to say.
Thanks very much, Barbara. Much appreciated. And now the last presentation from trans-led and trans-competent organizations, our colleagues and our guests on this space. So I would like to invite someone very special, very inspiring, very senior activist, Mr. Mauro Cabral Greenspan, who is the Executive Director of GATE, the Global Action for Trans Equality. Mauro, the floor is yours. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Chamindra. Thank you for the kind introduction. Even when I believe when you say senior, you mean old, but that's fine. You know, old, yeah, is a new, yeah, hot thing. So I want to start by expressing my gratitude to ILGA and to you to organize this space and to open it to the participation of trans organizations and networks and activists, and also for producing the original guide and for the update. And I want to, in particular, to express my gratitude to Xenia for her constant support to trans activists, organizations, and networks in our work on treaty bodies, not only because of her generosity in sharing her expert knowledge, but also for her political commitment and support in a moment when supporting trans people can be assumed to be a given for any of us, and where all of our allies risk paying a price or actually pay a price for expressing their support. We have always count on Xenia support. So on behalf of GATE, I want really to express that out loud. So going to the particular issue of this conversation, the previous presenters made a great job in highlighting different opportunities for engagement with treaty bodies in general and with this particular one, like acronyms in English are a nightmare for me, like CESCR. In the case of GATE, and and after years of continuous partnership with different with many of you, we got to a point when we realized that it was clear for many people, including UN staff and people in missions, but also our colleagues and partners, allies, and even donors, that issues like access to legal gender recognition and access to gender affirming procedures or trans-specific healthcare were human rights issues, and that access to legal recognition and access to transitional or trans-specific healthcare needed to happen under human rights standards, and that the only requirements compatible with human rights standards were basically informed consent based on self-determination. So the conceptual and normative framework that CERF has provided to us has been key to advance trans depathologization, but also to ensure that issues of gender identity and gender expressions are recognized as key issues in the human rights framework. But at some point in the over the last, I would say maybe the last couple of years, we realized that different countries have been improving their gender identity laws, and some countries have also been improving the systems for allowing people to get access to transitional healthcare. And there are some improvements in terms of access to education, and some improvements in access to work and to housing, and access to protection against discrimination based on gender identity, and under certain degree gender expression. But there is something that remains constant. And of course, we can say like violence remains constant, and that's true, and violence is increasing. But there is another thing that concerns particularly CERSC, which is that in spite of many legal and even social changes, trans people can be poor. And when we analyze data coming from all over the world, we see, and even from my own country, from Argentina, having a great gender identity law, and even having some provisions about allowing trans people to have a better access to employment, we see the trans and gender diverse people keep being poor because the different reasons, because lack of access to education, lack of access to decent jobs, or works without decent salary, or because of the association of different intersectional factors. What we are seeing as a constant around the world is that it doesn't matter the region. When we see trans and gender diverse people, we see that a large majority in our communities are still poor people. And that changing our ID, for example, won't change that reality in a substantive way. So what we decided to do was to engage in the work around poverty in relation to the 2030 agenda, but also thinking how we can make sure that when the UN hears about trans people, can go beyond gender identity, gender expression, access to healthcare, depathologization, non-discrimination based on gender identity and gender expression, how we can make the UN understand that when we talk about trans people, we are talking about socioeconomic injustice. And one of the goals of our work, and we are in the process of producing our next strategic plan. And I want to acknowledge the participation of many of you that are in this call in the surveys and conversations around our previous work plan and also our current work plan. One of our goals is to make sure that trans and gender diverse people are identified and acknowledged and included as a key population in the global response to poverty. And just to be clear, CESCR doesn't mention explicitly the right to be free from poverty, but however, in 2001, released a statement um, that provides a key definition on poverty and one of the key pillars of the UN approach to poverty. So the work that we are doing right now, and we have started by doing some like trainings, putting together like toolkits, and trying to see how we can frame has to do with changing the conversation about trans issues at the UN to make sure that socioeconomic issues, and in particular international fight against poverty, is at the core of the understanding. And of course, we can debate, like because some people say, I don't want the UN to see a trans person and immediately assume that that person is poor. So some people say we don't want to build that link, but actually what we are seeing, and just to connect to what Barbara was saying, actually the situation is that poverty is one of the key issues affecting our communities in the entire lifespan. And when we see the intersection between not only access to legal gender recognition when it's not affordable, but access to healthcare, to trans-specific healthcare, or to general healthcare, what we see is a key issue is that people don't have the money to afford basic healthcare. That even when we discuss, for example, and GATE is part of that process on universal access to healthcare, and people say, well, there is, certain medical procedures, for example, or healthcare procedures that people could cover out of their, their pocket, or considering a certain percentage of the household income. We're saying there is a vast majority of trans people that doesn't have a household income, because among other issues, there is no household when we are talking about a really big number of trans people living in extreme poverty and or being homeless. So in this moment of time in which anti-gender movements are creating this idea that trans people, and especially trans women, could be dangerous to women if we are allowed to go to shelters, we are seeing a huge increase in poverty and in the need to accessing socioeconomic support coming from, an increasing demand coming from trans people. So this is our approach. And again, we are in the process of building that approach. And I hope that in the years to come, we can work together to make socioeconomic justice for trans and gender diverse people a reality that we all in all regions can enjoy. Okay, thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you very much, Mauro. Some very, very insightful comments and points there that you have raised, which are full of food for thought. And thank you very much to all our presenters, from our colleagues from trans-led organizations, Transgender Europe, the Asia Pacific Transgender Network, the East Africa Trans Health and Advocacy Network, and the Global Action for Trans Equality. So friends, now at this stage, we move on to a question and answer session. And our participants are welcome to ask questions and raise questions to our panelists and to our colleagues here. And we have, to begin with, we have one question from Kellen Botha. Kellen asks, given that most countries are signatories to CESCR or CESCR and other UN treaty bodies, are there any known examples of activists using human rights locally to successfully change legislation without having to take the matter all the way to the UN? So it's an interesting and insightful question. Xenia, would you like to make a few comments on that question?
Yeah, I think maybe it's more questions, more a question to other colleagues, because as ILGA World, we are mostly supporting activists with their engagement with the UN. And if I understand correctly, so Kaylin's question is more about how we can use these frameworks to organize our regional, or rather local, or country advocacy. So maybe there were some examples of other organizations who know about more local efforts.
Thanks, Tanya. Would our panelist colleagues like to make any comments to Kellen's question?
I will say that the laws on particular provisions to ensure, to create trans and quotas for trans and people and for travestis in Argentina in access to employment are a successful example, because they're using and I will say that all treaties and conventions, international and regional one, have constitutional stand in Argentina. So it's easier in our system to use the international human rights framework as a local framework. So I can share, or like I think that the creation of trans quotas in public employment is a successful example of that.
Thank you, Mauro. Thanks very much. So thank you, Kellen, for your question. We also have comment, more than a question, a comment from Alex Castillo from Guatemala. And bear with me a second. We'll try to get the question translated into English. So Alex's question goes as follows. So I'm very concerned that for this country, meaning to Guatemala, everything is uphill for our population, since the Commissioner Edgar Stuardo Ralón Orellana from Guatemala left a footnote voting against the DESCA. It is much more difficult to make an impact having members of the state with this type of position. We publicly denounced this great violation of our rights as Guatemalan transgender people. So that's more of a comment. And we have another question from Theo Haglund. Says, I have contacted IESOGI by mail, but how do I know? Bear with me a second. But how do I know if the UN is going to intervene? So that's a practical question. Would any of our panelists like to share some insights into getting in touch? How can rights activists effectively get in touch with Mr. Madrigal-Borlos? Xenia?
I can provide some information, or maybe some other colleagues, I'm sure, would be able to do this. But specifically, I would ask what was exactly the mode of your communication with the independent expert, because like one thing is when you formally submit information for a complaint, to the state. And in this case, you can find I can also share later a link where you can find all the communications actually made by different special procedures, including independent expert on SOGI, made to the countries. And you can also find their answers, replies from this country. So that's, I would say that would be my answer. But then the question is, I would ask the person who asked this question, what was exactly the procedure? Like, was it informal communication, just like maybe informal chat with Victor, or maybe you submitted your information specifically for anything?
Thank you, Xenia. So we do have a few minutes left. So if any of our guests, our participants like to raise any questions, you're very welcome to type your questions in the Q&A box there. And we will definitely take up your questions. And we do have quite a few comments from our guests. So Susan has mentioned that, we accomplished this goal in Canada over 15 years a period. I could give a good presentation on our successes and so on. And we do have colleagues and guests raising issues that concern human rights violations in specific and human rights related challenges in specific parts of the world.
Yeah, I would like, if possible, to say a couple of things very briefly about Trans Advocacy Week, as the project was mentioned by Barbara, if that's okay, just to provide a context for other people that are in the conversation. So Trans Advocacy Week, it's a project that started 4 years ago, and it's coordinated by a group of 5 organizations, which in most of the cases are trans-led organizations with other partners that have trans projects. But it's not a group of wealthy organizations or projects that put our wealth together. It's a group of organizations that are working together because we know each other, but mostly because we don't have the money to do it by ourselves. So the way in which Trans Advocacy Week has been organized historically is by different organizations chipping in with the money that we can take from other programs of work, as for most of its existence, Trans Advocacy Week had not a dedicated donor or amount of money dedicated, and to put our own staff time in trying to organize it, which means, for example, that if an organization doesn't have the money, can contribute with with communications or with translation, or one organization pay for. Sometimes we can have 2 people in one room, and in the cheapest hotel in Geneva, and one organization will pay for one bed, another organization will pay for another. So in the sense, it's a collaborative effort that had make our best to include activists from all over the world, including African activists, or including African activists from Latin America, or including activists from Russian-speaking countries. So in that sense, as a project, it always can be improved, and it will be improved by adding more people, but not having money, or what is considered to be like lack of capacity, has never been an issue. It is a project where many people come together to get as many activists as possible, trans activists as possible, at the UN for 1 week. So all of us working together, what we do is being able to take 10 people, 12 people for a week, 1 day of training, 5 days of advocacy work, all over the year. So on one hand, of course, I accept that all partnerships and all projects can be better and will need to be better. On the other hand, again, I will repeat, when we talk about work on trans issues, usually there is not a lot of money, which means that trans organizations don't have a lot of funding, and projects focused on trans issues in mainstream LGTB organizations don't have a lot of money either. And no one in terms of donors is super interested in getting 100 trans people like storming the UN. I would love to say we are so rich that actually, I don't know, we are going to have an entire trans year every year. So I take your input very seriously, Barbara, and you have my commitment and the commitment of all the partners to say, let's make our best to ensure that African activists are included in all the process. But at the same time, I will like respectfully you and everyone to acknowledge the effort that had implied historically to be able to put a foot there and to make sure that activists from all regions every year get at least a week where we can work together and to build a community at the UN. So please accept my apologies for the way in which it has worked so far. There are many political advances that need to be made, but I assure you that the spirit in which we are doing is to have inclusivity as a key organizing principle. Thank you, Chaminda, for allowing me to take the floor to express this.
Grant, thank you, Maro. Those are, I mean, very important comments when it comes to, Trans Advocacy Week and the challenges involved. So we have two questions, one from Tristan Lopez and another one from Jonathan Espinosa Rodriguez. I'm sorry if I mispronounced the first name, Jonathan. So Tristan's question is about, these two questions are kind of interlinked. Tristan's question is mostly about institutions. So he says, thank you for the presentation. I have noticed that in Latin America, especially Central America, the issue around LGBTQI human rights has a lot to do with weak institutions. Do you have any insights on how we can strengthen institutions without postponing LGBTQI plus issues? And the question from our other guest, Jonathan, has to do with the case of Colombia, how to influence from this space to be able to stop the systemic murder, how to challenge or how to contain the systemic murder and systemic discrimination of leaders, trans community leaders in Colombia, and starting from how to challenge non-recognition by the state, and issues specific to local contexts. And would our panelist colleagues like to share any insights on how UN advocacy could be effectively kind of, any final comments on how UN advocacy could really provide food for thought to our colleagues facing specific challenges of this nature in their local contexts?
Yeah, so I think that it's definitely a big problem, and the thing is that there are different mechanisms within the UN system, and you can kind of create your own list of important mechanisms depending on your topic. So, for instance, if we are speaking about killings and murders of human rights defenders, specifically trans human rights defenders, then we can consider, for example, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, the Independent Expert on SOGI, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, and of course, all the treaty bodies, or most of them. And then also we can organize, or local defenders, they can organize more urgent advocacy activities. So for example, for two special procedures, you can submit communications literally the same day when violation happened, or the next day. For treaty bodies, usually it's more long-term process, but also like there could be opportunities for submitting shadow reports, for participating in the sessions, etc., etc. And if anyone is interested in like working with us or getting any consultation from my side, of course, I would be happy to provide more information on this.
Thank you, Senia. Thanks very much. So on that note, guests and panelist colleagues, it's time to wrap up this webinar. So a key point to highlight, reiterate would be the fact that there is no magic wand in international human rights advocacy. However, treaty bodies, special procedures, and interactions, the more our colleagues, rights activists, can engage with supranational institutions, in this case specifically the United Nations and treaty bodies, that kind of engagement can have a strengthening effect on rights advocacy done at local level in facing pressing systemic challenges locally. So that is a key point to take home. And at ourselves at ILGA World, we are always prepared to help and support, engage with our colleagues and friends and family, chosen family across the world in trans and intersex communities to figure out ways of supporting our friends and family when engaging with especially the United Nations institutions, the United Nations bodies. So on that note, panelists and guests, we would like to mention a final comment that this webinar today has been recorded, and the edited video of this webinar will be made available on our social media outlets of ILGA World in the next few days, so that there will be a record of these proceedings that you can revisit. And I would like to extend a very special word of thanks to Xenia for your insights and your commitment to making this this event happen, and word of appreciation also to Dr. Julia Ahert, Director of Programs at ILGA World, and a big thank you to all our panelists to join us, to Barbara, to Samreen, and to Mauro. And a word of thanks also to Jabu, who joined us at the beginning of this webinar to make the welcome statement. And on that note, thank you, friends, for joining us from different parts of the world, from different time zones. And for some of you, this is not a very hospitable time to join us, but you've stayed right throughout the 1.5 hours with us. So thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. It's been a great pleasure having you on board. And on behalf of ILGA World, thank you very much, and have a nice day, have a nice evening, and we'll see you soon with a similar lineup of events. Thanks very much.